let's now take you straight to Moscow, where Xi Jinping landed earlier this week for a two-day visit. On his itinerary was a meet-and-greet session with the Russian President Vladimir Putin and a round of formal talks. This was Xi's first visit to Russia since the start of the Ukraine war. Also, his first trip outside China since securing a third term in office. Of course, the visit was a symbolic show of support for Putin, an important show of support. It was also an attempt to show the world that Xi Jinping is ready to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia or anybody else, that is ready to play peacemaker. And it's a larger stature. It's not just about China being a nuisance or threatening its neighbors or threatening war on Taiwan. China now wants to play a bigger role, and it can play a bigger role. The visit was about sending a message to countries around the world that Xi Jinping will now be playing, or at least will be trying to play, a global role. The 69-year-old president has all the support he needs from inside China, whether they like it or not. He's just been formally re-elected for a historic third term. And on the same day that his third term was given a formal approval, a very strategically timed announcement was made by a country thousands of miles away from China, from Saudi Arabia. And I'm just going to be talking about this story for a couple of minutes before I come back to those images of Russia and China, of Xi Jinping symbolically, literally, figuratively towering over Vladimir Putin and what the implications of that are. Before I go into that in more detail, I do want to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and about Iran. So returning to Saudi Arabia, Riyadh put out this particular Gazette notification. It read, and I'm quoting here, in response to the noble initiative of His Excellency President Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China's support for developing good neighborly relations between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and based on the agreement between His Excellency President Xi Jinping and the leaderships in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, whereby the People's Republic of China would host and sponsor talks between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, proceeding from their shared desire to resolve the disagreement between them, so on and so forth. Very clear. Attempts are being made to get Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and those attempts seem to have been successful. At least the immediate hostility has been ratcheted down. But the highlight of this for the rest of the world is, look who the person is who's doing it. It is China. Saudi Arabia and Iran trying to become friends again, or if not friends, at least stop being enemies again. The two countries will be reopening embassies, they'll be establishing ties, they'll be inking perhaps a security agreement. But it's all thanks to Beijing, to China. Saudi Arabia and Iran, incidentally, had broken off ties in 2016. This was after protesters invaded Saudi posts in Iran. Why? Because Riyadh had executed a prominent Shia scholar. Now, China is going to be putting out a message that, hey, we put an end to the Cold War between these two countries. Analysts were left asking, how is it possible? How did China suddenly play a role? Because Saudi Arabia, let's face it, has always historically been very close to America. The equation has been simple. America buys energy from the Saudis, and it provides weapons and security in exchange. And there's been all sorts of implications of that. In fact, everyone was talking about the fact that maybe America is now going to take the Abraham Accords forward, try and push for closer relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. America till now has really been the titan, the peacemaker, the all-important power in the Middle East. And now, what's happening out here? Saudi Arabia, visibly coming closer to China, which at least appears to be telling the world that it is trying to bring together the Arab world, which is a domain that the US is really likely to pay a diplomat in. The Abraham Accords, which I was just talking about a couple of seconds ago, were just one of the many examples of America playing peacemaker. But let's remember, those accords are now almost 3 years old. And the sands of the West Asian landscape are shifting once again. And this time the wind appears to be blowing in the direction of Beijing. It helped in this case, of course, that Iran was a big player, and America has absolutely no leverage on Iran. So to that extent, China's attempts to play global peacemaker are not necessarily at the cost of America. America can always say, this was a peace deal we couldn't have done, only China could have played that role. And to some extent, What's happening right now between China and Russia is somewhat similar. Obviously, there's no relationship right now between the West and Russia. The West cannot try and play mediator or peacemaker between Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't have the locus standi. It is actively backing one side of it. So who else can? G20, perhaps. And that's something that India would have liked, especially because India is the president of G20. Maybe India would like to have been seen as one of the countries leading to some sort of a peace effort in Ukraine as the president of G20. But now, that is now in question. Because, let's return to that visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow. Among the many statements that came out of here, between the declarations of friendship between China and Russia, which are enough reasons to have some concern, there were some specific statements that would make New Delhi very, very uncomfortable. There was talk about criticizing the Indo-Pacific, saying that the Indo-Pacific is not a good concept. That worries India because it's strategically very important for India. And second, a direct statement made there by Russia and by China saying that there should be no question of G20 having anything to say on Ukraine. And that's a problem for India because it is bound to come up at the G20 summit a little later in the year. So what exactly is happening out here? What are the implications of Russia, China, and this close partnership or friendship, or call it what you will, and what are going to be the implications for India? And to try and understand what exactly is happening there between China and Russia, we're now being joined by Vikram Chandra, who's the former German ambassador to China and to Japan. He's also a senior distinguished fellow as the SWP, which is the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us, Herr Volkel. Just wanted to understand, what do you make of the recent overtures that China has been making? It's almost trying to position itself as the peacemaker of the world, which is somewhat ironic considering what else China has been doing. It's now flying to Russia, earlier trying to broker some sort of a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, had some success on that. How do you interpret all of this?
Well, to put it ironically, a peacemaker, if you use that term, then I'd say a peacemaker who doesn't manage to make peace. But leaving irony aside, I think this has to be understood very much in terms of Xi Jinping's personality. You know, he himself was fairly weakened due to his zero COVID policy in China. And there were doubts across the country, as you could see at the end of last year during the protests all over the country, all of a sudden, surprise to everybody, that he has not gained in popularity by his policy. And as China is in a weak position anyway, I mean, mainly economically, but increasing doubts were observable worldwide, whether China would still be able to play a role as before the COVID pandemic, that is a coming world power. I think Xi Jinping understood this also as doubts about his own personal standing in the country and in the world. So what he's trying to show now is that he himself, with China, of course, is coming back to the world stage with a vengeance. He's showing at every possible area that he is really in control of things. Look at the visit to Moscow. I mean, to go for 3 days on such a visit, that is extraordinary. It is a signal. And you said peacemaker, probably you allude to the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, mediated by the Chinese. That, of course, is also a symbol. I mean, the two countries are far from having really resolved their problems with each other, but it serves both sides' interests to re-establish diplomatic relations. Now, China used that opportunity, and it showed at the same time to the world, and mainly that is to the great rival, to the US, that it also may play a big role in the Middle East, which it hasn't done so far.
So let's now look at both of those in some detail. The trip to Russia first. China is not necessarily seen as a neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine, so it's not that China is going to be able to play peacemaker out there. But it appears to many people that there's a very strong axis that is now developing between Russia and China? And is that something that you're seeing as well? Are the two of them really going to start operating in a very close and in a very synergistic manner in the global stage? And is that a very big risk to the existing global order?
Axis, I think, is well-chosen term. But an axis where one wheel is the bigger one and the other wheel is a much smaller one. Because Putin has already weakened his country in its relationship with China. And whatever the outcome of the war will be, he will be weakened. Because let's assume he succeeds in Ukraine, at the same time, he will still be an outcast internationally. And that, of course, has an enormous impact on Russia's economic situation. So he will depend in a much greater degree than so far on China. And China's already been showing that it is ready to step in. The economic relations have been very profitable for China over the past year. If Putin, however, is weakened, as I think a majority of people in the world assume at this time, at the end of this war, then he will be in even more desperate straits in his relationship with China. And he will be totally a client state of China, which serves Chinese interests well. And that is why Xi Jinping went to such great pains in traveling to Moscow now and reassuring Putin that in the end, we are on your side. We're not fully your ally. We're not yet delivering weapons, but you can count on us. Limitless friendship.
So when you're looking at where and how far this could extend, many in the West sound rather scared about the fact that you have China and Russia and potentially Iran, which also may feel that it owes China a little bit, having de-escalated tensions with Saudi Arabia to some level. You can throw Iran into the mix as well. So there's a reasonably formidable alliance of interests which are broadly anti-Western, and they're all coming together.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is a scenario that is very serious, and it does not concern the West alone. It concerns the world as such, the world as it was organized after the Second World War, which is a multilateralist system, the UN system, where countries on more or less equal footing try to sort out their problems together. Think of things like the climate conference, now the water conference, and of course, more important, even more important things such as human rights in many countries. So the world is built on the principle of sovereign states cooperating in resolving their problems. Now, if you get a world that is dominated, not necessarily dominated, but influenced, impacted to a large degree by countries that have an imperial kind of mindset, that are working to increase their own influence even by military means, such as Russia now, of course China too, and Iran. Well, that has not yet happened, that Iran has gone to war, but you may compare it in its mindset. If you have a world impacted by such countries, then you have what we call a multipolar world, where each pole is free, at liberty, to pursue its own interests, even with military means. And that would weaken mainly, let's say, medium-sized countries such as European countries, but the majority of the countries in the world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America too.
So let's just come to Europe in detail if we can, because in the Indo-Pacific or the Pacific side, at least there are signs, there's some sort of alliances and groupings coming together, which could perhaps take on or confront or contain China in that part of the world, whether it's AUKUS or Quad or anything else. What's Europe's position in all of this? Because sometimes there have been questions about what is going to be the approach of countries like Germany, for example, or other countries in Western Europe, because they do have close relations, or at least a certain dependency on China in some way. They also have certain relations with Russia, which date back to some time. So which way do you think Europe is going to go in this new world order that seems to be emerging?
That's a big question. I'll try to give two answers. One is that Europe certainly has amazed many in the world, many observers, by the unity it has shown after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think that was unexpected, and honestly speaking, unexpected to many Europeans as well. But the way we have allied ourselves with the US and the majority in the General Assembly of the United Nations showed that there is still the strength of Europe existing, which is strength in unity. That's one side. And I think we're working quite well on that side of the coin. The other side is that we're not sure how long this can last, because we are impacted more than most countries in the world by the effects of the return effects, the echo effects of the sanctions policies, because we were had a very close relationship economically with Russia, not only in the energy sector, in many industrial areas as well. And this is something that is lacking now. Of course, this impacts negatively our own economic development. How long can that last? If there is a crisis here or there, maybe even a recession, how will people then think about the war in Ukraine? And will we be able to hold together the way we are doing now? Now, as you know, we just have the European Council going on today. And this is certainly one of the problems the heads of state and government of Europe will be looking at.
No, I guess you're right. And for a country like India, of course, this is a particularly strange sort of a development and a worrying development, because historically, Russia has been an ally of India. China has been anything but a friend and enemy, if anything. And China does have another client state, which is Pakistan. So that particular axis is already inimical to India. So a lot of people are quite uncomfortable in India that what happens if Russia, this great ally of India, now ends up becoming a client state of China as well. What does that mean for India? What does it mean for this part of the world and for its security?
Well, I'm the last to say a word about India, except from the position of a faraway observer. But let me say, understanding the conundrum China's in presently led me early on to the question why India doesn't use its position as the chair of the G20 to try to mediate. Because of the situation that you have just described, isn't India in a position where it is somewhere between the various sides for obvious reasons, for its own interests, like the old alliance with Russia, like its little bit tenuous relationship with China, but also with a flowering relationship to other countries in Asia and even the United States? Wouldn't it, as the G20 chair, be in a position where it could try with some hope for success to mediate between the different sides? It has not tried that yet, but I think that would be commensurate to India's standing.
You know, that's a really excellent and an interesting idea, and I'm sure the Indian government is thinking about it. Although I know that both Russia and China said in their statement, we would not like the G20 to step into whatever's happening in Ukraine. They said that really, really clearly, and we know where they're coming from. But India trying to intervene could be an interesting idea. Close relations with Russia, potentially seen as a viable mediator by Ukraine as well. But I'm not very sure that there is a solution anyway. At least on this program, the last few weeks and months, if you talk to anybody on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, there seems to be absolutely no meeting ground. So there may be people somewhat concerned to say, well, we can try mediation, but I'm not very sure whether there's going to be a solution. I guess you could argue that at least you're seen to be trying.
Others are trying, like Erdogan in Turkey.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, diplomacy is a wide open field. You never know where negotiations end once you start them, and it may come to a productive end. And yes, you're right. At the present situation, I think Zelensky has just said yesterday, was it, or this morning even, that at the present time, there is no space for negotiations because what Russia set out as its position was exactly the same as in February of last year. So that, of course, is no common ground to start talks, but that may change even tomorrow.
All right, Herr Walker, thank you so much for joining us with that. All right, let's now turn a little bit to the India angle. Xi Jinping has clearly not shied away from telling his country that China should, quote, actively participate in the reform and construction of the global governance system. Xi has also gone on to say China should add what he called positive energy to world peace and development. In other words, what Xi is trying to say is that going forward, you should be prepared for more diplomatic coups. You should be prepared for China trying to stride the global stage as a peacemaker. Now, obviously, India is going to be scratching his head and figuring out what all of that means, because in this part of the world, China is anything but a peacemaker, quite the opposite. So far, India's China headaches have been fairly extensive. What China is doing on the line of actual control, what it's doing in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, what it's doing in Arunachal Pradesh, what it's doing in the Indian Ocean, and of course, Beijing's support to Pakistan, which has essentially become a client state sometime back. That's been India's major headache. This headache, these questions that are now arising, are in some ways slightly more serious, because if you look at India's strategic autonomy, and all experts have been talking about this fairly extensively in the last few days, India's strategic autonomy, let's have a multipolar world, let's have the West can be one pole and we are reasonably friendly with them, India should be another pole, maybe you can have Russia as another pole, China will be a pole. It's a multipolar world and India has a certain strategic autonomy, and that's at least been the belief till now, and it's been a great goal for India to strive towards. But what happens to all of those concepts of strategic autonomy if one of India's greatest allies and supporters all these decades, Russia in other words, now becomes a junior partner or a client state in some manner to China? Because China, let's be clear, whatever else you may think about the world, there are very few possibilities or scenarios where China is going to be a friendly power to India. The China question is always going to be India's #1 challenge, #1 threat. Let's underline that. That is the reality. So when India navigates the world, keeping that China factor in mind, what happens to India's strategic autonomy? What are the adjustments that India will now have to make in light of what has just happened in Moscow between Russia and China? Well, let's throw that question to a really key person who's been watching all of this and analyzing this very closely, Professor Harsh Pant, who's the Vice President of Studies in Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. He's also a professor at the King's College in London, been really analyzing this entire area in some great detail. Professor Pant, you've been writing extensively about the Indo-Pacific and how important it is for India's security. And now suddenly we're having one of our closest strategic allies, Russia, joining China in saying that the Indo-Pacific is a bad concept. What does that mean for India?
Well, Vikram, first of all, it reflects how, in terms of the global discourse, it's strange, but Russia and China seem to be the only two countries that believe that it is a bad concept, that it does not really reflect the needs of our times. So in some ways, Indo-Pacific has become a means through which the larger world, and India included here, has been able to isolate China and Russia. Now, the other aspect is what it means. I think it has a very, very important meaning for India, because for a very long time we have been deluding ourselves into believing that eventually we will be able to bring Russia on board as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. There are many in India who have argued that, look, Russia is also an Indo-Pacific country. If only we keep the channels of communication open, we will be able to handle Russia's concerns and we will be able to bring Russia on board. Now, clearly that is not happening. Clearly, we have seen the kind of relationship that is developing between China and Russia is of a different order, and where Putin looks like a pygmy in terms of literally and figuratively, because you have a relationship where China is the dominant player. It is calling all the shots, and it has been able to convince Russia that Indo-Pacific, that anything to do with the Indo-Pacific, that its partnerships in the wider Indo-Pacific are irrelevant. It has to follow the strategic logic that China wants it to follow. And this is something that will have a fundamentally transformative effect on India, whether we like to believe it or not. And because for the first time, we will have Russia, which is taking a position on a broader geostrategic matter, which is going to be quite in opposition to us, in opposition to what India believes in opposition to what India's strategic interests are. So how do you then configure this relationship that you have been arguing is historical, it's very important, it's important, but that there's nothing that can do damage to this relationship. So I think we need to start figuring out a response to that bigger problem.
Professor Pant, before we come to the challenges, just help us understand, for people who are not strategic thinkers and are not experts in international relations, they're sometimes wondering what's the big deal about Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific, and what is the relevance of these concepts and terms, and why does it matter if you're talking about Indo-Pacific and not Asia-Pacific? Just help us understand that in words of one syllable.
Every geography that we create is an imagined geography, and I think for a very long time the world had believed, and this is largely the major players in world politics, and in particular the US, that they can divide Asia into two distinct groups. So if you see the way State Department was organized in the past, if you see the way policy documents were written, they would say South Asia and Asia Pacific, as if these are two distinct entities where South Asia exists as a microcosm, and Asia Pacific is the real deal. So India was never seen as part of the wider Asian landscape, and I think that has been India's problem throughout its post-independent history, that India had been made marginal by others. And I think now what is happening is that as the balance of power is changing, thanks to China, the world is realizing that it is no longer possible to view Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans as two distinct maritime zones. So instead, you have to look at this as one contiguous maritime zone, because only when you do that will you be able to appreciate the magnitude of the change. Will you be able to bring on board the kind of capacities that are needed to shape this security and strategic architecture? And you will be able to respond proactively to this dynamic. And that's why this connection between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean is important. And it is important for India because India stands at the heart of this geography.
All right, I get that then. So the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the reason why it's strategically so crucial for India is India doesn't get boxed into South Asia. There's India and there's Pakistan, Afghanistan, a few other countries there in South Asia. Indo-Pacific, and suddenly India is a central pillar of that, and therefore a very big global player. That, you're saying, is the importance of the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, Russia going along with China and saying, we don't believe in the Indo-Pacific and it's irrelevant, what happens then? What happens to India in that? Because let's face it, there's another challenge. G20 presidency is with India, and now Russia's also joined China in saying, don't even raise Ukraine out there. So India's challenges have become that much more difficult this week.
Yes, and I think on the G20 issue, we have already seen that challenge manifests itself at the finance ministers meeting and foreign ministers meeting, where we could not come out with a joint communique. Now, when you look at this Russia question, Russia question is important and interesting for India, because for a very long time, as we were discussing earlier, India and Russia had been on the same page. We have had the same views on largely how the world was evolving, how we wanted to position ourselves. We wanted a multipolar world. They wanted a multipolar world. But primarily, I think their desire was to shape a post-American world order in which Russia played an important role. Now, what has happened is that while India has moved in the interstate hierarchy, Russia has gone down. So Russia's ability to shape that post-American world order is becoming very, very restricted and constricted. And in that space, China has filled that vacuum. China has become the dominant player. And as Russian and especially Putin's foreign policy has become anti-Western, India has also become marginal. Look, because India's relationship is very important. For India, its relations with the West are important. Its relations with Russia are important, primarily because of the China factor. Our most important strategic challenge is China. And India is perhaps the only country that, while it needs Russia in the short term to manage China because of the defense engagement, it needs West to manage China in the long term. So you have a very distinct way in which India is looking at the world, whereas Russia, because it has been losing one advantage after another, and it is not playing any more of an economic role in world politics. And by I think invading Ukraine, it is also taken a position which has been detrimental to its larger strategic interests, whatever Mr. Putin might say today. The fact is that that has brought Russia to a level where the world and I think many in Russia are also looking at the spectacle of how Russia has become almost a vassal state of China, almost a junior partner, which is very visible. And I think therefore they are dictated by how the Chinese are viewing the world. They have very few options. And therefore, when the Chinese say we don't want anything to do with Indo-Pacific, they have to follow it through because they have a larger challenge in Eurasia vis-a-vis the West, which they are more bothered about.
So look, in India's case, at least from many strategic thinkers, feel that India would ideally like a multipolar world. India would like to have a multipolar world where it has strategic autonomy. Now, it's not as if India doesn't have squabbles with the West. India constantly keeps on arguing with the West in many ways. Look what's been unfolding with Britain, for example, in the last couple of days. But India now seems to be confronting a situation where you've got China, the big threat and the big enemy. You already got Pakistan as the client state of China, and now Russia, who's been India's strategic ally, potentially also becoming a junior partner, if not a client state of China. In your view, if that is really the situation, does India have no choice but to start looking for closer and closer ties with the West?
I think so. I think some of the more, some of the debates that we have been having, and they are very relevant debates in terms of how Russia matters to us. It matters in the Eurasian context. We still need security as far as our northern border is concerned, northern periphery is concerned, where the entire Central Asian belt is very important for us. The whole extremism, terrorism threat that emanates from there continues to impact on India. So if you recall, after the Americans left Afghanistan, there was visible engagement between India and Russia to ensure that we are on the same page as to what is happening in Central Asia and Afghanistan. So there are enormous interests there apart from defense that brings us together. But I think the broader strategic choices are becoming sharper and sharper. You really cannot fudge it anymore. And the more Russians and the Chinese come together, the more consolidated they become. I think Indian choices will have to become more explicit. And they are, I think, this brings us into this space where we are increasingly looking at a world that for India, I think is fundamentally, this is a fundamentally transformative moment. I would go so far as to say that I think the kind of structural realities that we faced in early 1990s with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, it's very likely that we are moving to a point where Russia-China consolidation poses us the similar kind of a structural challenge, whether that means enhancing our relations with the West, or to what extent we want to go with the West, or whether it means developing our own capacities. That's a question for Indian policymakers to answer, but perhaps a combination of both will be needed.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying building India's own capacity is, of course, a desirable outcome, and it must be done, but it could take some time for that to happen. Now, you're saying this week has been a fundamentally transformative fact, the fact that China and Russia are consolidating in this manner, and that means that at least in the short term or the medium term, India will have to look very closely at that relationship and therefore reassess its ties with the West and say, at least for a moment, there's no alternative but to have really close ties with the West. Is that what you're saying?
I think India will have to look at it. India will have to also reevaluate how far we can keep on arguing that Russia is a very valuable partner. It is a valuable partner, but what are the limits of that partnership? We have not seen that debate in public space in India with the kind of vigor that perhaps is needed at this particular moment.
All right, Professor Pant, we hear you loud and clear. Have a debate around the importance of Russia as a partner. Do the first step in that, start talking about it and keep that debate running. Ask what happens if Russia, one of India's closest strategic allies, essentially becomes a Chinese junior partner. What happens to India's strategic autonomy? What happens to India's options? Thank you, Professor Pant, for joining us, and we will keep on having a debate around that. Right, now it's going to be really interesting to see what length Xi Jinping goes to get an image facelift. The Chinese president is desperately trying to go from being the face of wolf warrior diplomacy to the face of global peace. Trust me, the irony is not lost on me.